Hey blues fans, this is Anthony from Texas Blues Alley. It's time for Tone Tuesday. This week we have the Ditto Looper from TC Electronics, and we're going to look at it from a very specific angle, and that angle is how can you use it to improve your blues rhythm playing to create a loop so that you can then use that loop to improve your lead playing by soloing over that loop. The Ditto is kind of like a mirror. It doesn't have an opinion, it just reflects what it sees. So if you have bad timing and you have a bad sense of what's appropriate blues rhythm, you'll find out pretty quickly both of those things when you start using the Ditto. At least for me, that's how it worked out. So I'm going to go through the basic controls just so you know how to use it. There are other videos that go more in depth. I'm going through the basic controls. Then I'm going to do kind of what I did when I first got it, which was just record a loop based on my first instincts of what I think a blues rhythm loop should sound like. And then I'm going to show you how hard that is to solo over. So I'm going to tell you what's wrong with what I did first, and then at the end we'll go through a bunch of tips that I figured out for how to record better loops or things that you can do when using a looper to help you create a better final product to solo over. So let's get started. Let's talk about how you would set up your gear if you're going to use a looper for blues. The first thing you want to do is you want to have a clean amp. The reason is, as we'll get into later, you want to create a variety of tones to help distinguish the different parts we're going to record. And if your amp is overdriven, that's going to force everything to sound a little bit more alike. So a nice clean tone is going to be your first step. The second step is you want to put your Ditto last in the pedal chain. The reason is when we get into using different pedals for different tones, the Ditto records whatever comes before it. So if you had your overdrive pedal after the Ditto, then your overdrive pedal is going to be, let's say you want to use the overdrive pedal when you're soloing, it's going to be overdriving the loop that's coming from the Ditto as well. This way, when the Ditto is looping, if you record it clean, since it's last in the chain, it will be passing a recording of the clean loop along with just the overdriven sound of your pedal. So that's a long-winded way of saying put the Ditto last in the chain. In terms of the controls for the Ditto, I'll put up a little chart in a little bit that shows you the basic idea. But the main concept you need to understand is that the first time through, whatever you record becomes the duration of the official loop. From here to here, however long you play, whether it's 12 bars or 8 bars, you cannot change that once you lay down the first loop. Any other parts that you overdub just fit into that however you happen to stack them. So that's something that took me a little bit to wrap my head around. But now let me put a little chart on the screen that you can look at. You can probably find this online. It just shows you the number of taps from the different states that help you understand when you're playing, when you're stopping, when you're recording, and that sort of thing. So now I'm going to record an example of what a typical player might do when they first get the Ditto and has never played lead over their own rhythm. It's not something you usually get a chance to do. And so I'm going to intentionally make some of the mistakes that I did first. So here's my mentality. I got the Ditto. I'm going to use this. You've heard that blues rhythm before. So my thinking is I get this, all right, I'm going to lay a nice gritty rhythm down, and then I'm just going to solo over it. So I'm going to kick on my overdrive pedal here, and I'm just going to start. All right, now I'm going to try and solo over that. Now let's talk about what was wrong with what you just heard. There's a whole bunch of them, but let me just pick out a few. Number one, it was too busy. My rhythm part wasn't just rhythm, because every once in a while I'd go, which is a lead line. And it's one thing if you're the only guitar player, but if you're laying down rhythm for somebody else to solo over, you don't want to do solo type stuff, because then it ends up sounding like two players soloing at the same time, and that's a terrible idea. So the first thing wrong is that I took my single guitar player mentality and I brought it into a multiple guitar player scenario where I have a rhythm and a lead part. So that's the first thing you need to think about, is that it was too busy. Second thing is that it was a terrible loop. I hit the button and then I started playing. And then I got done and I played my ending and then I stomped on it to stop. That left a gap of almost, half a second or whatever, so that the loop wouldn't repeat back on itself. So it had, it wasn't a perfect loop, and there was also plenty of poor timing in there, because I think my timing's great, so I record my loop and then I try and solo over it. If I've got poor timing naturally when I'm playing the loop, I'm also going to have poor timing when I'm soloing, and so you've got these two non-fixed timing systems trying to line up with each other. So we're going to talk about how to fix all of those things. The bottom line is, the way that I did it, it was not fun to solo over, and it was downright embarrassing when I got to the end of the chorus, and I couldn't continue because I had to wait for the loop to start again. So having said all that, let's get into the tips about how to actually record a good blues rhythm loop to solo over. Tip number one is play clean. You want to save your dirt for the soloing part, so for your rhythm parts, you want to stick to clean tones. On top of that, you can add in a little bit of compressor so that it makes your clean rhythm a little bit fatter. So instead of this, you'd get something like... That's cleaner, it's a little bit fatter, it would be much easier to solo over. Tip number two is to use layers. One of the nice things about the Ditto is that you can lay down a main loop and then layer additional parts over that. So instead of this, instead of that in and of itself doesn't make a great blues rhythm to solo over, so we're going to separate that into three parts. We're going to have a main rhythm part, we're going to have a bass part, and then we're going to have an upper part. You might be wondering, why am I doing this instead of... The reason is that has a lot of transients, a lot of spiky peaks, and it's on the upper strings where I'm going to be doing a lot of my soloing. So if I'm going to play something high, I want to keep it a little bit subdued, and because I'm dragging these chords out, there's less of those peaks to interrupt the peaks that will come with single note soloing. So tip number two, again, is to separate your rhythm into different parts. Tip number three is use a metronome on the first loop. The reason for this is that when you're recording the main loop, you want that timing to be dead on, and the only way to do that is to use a metronome. I don't recommend using a metronome for the additional loops, because now you're going to have to get the metronome synced back up with the loop, and that can just make it more confusing. If you use the metronome for the first loop, that will help everything else to be more in time. Now, the tip number four is to start with the busiest layer first. So the layers that I talked about, you've got your bass part, you've got your upper part, those are both not terribly busy, but the main loop that's the busiest one, and it will also be the one that benefits the most from having a metronome. So tip number four is to record the busiest loop first. Tip number five is start with the end with the beginning. What I'm talking about is that the end of our loop is what you want to start with, And then you want to hit the ditto to start the loop right at there. You don't want to just start the loop because you're not really in the, you want to capture the feel of a continuous loop. So you would start your ditto. Then as you get closer to the end, stop it in the same place, but then continue to play through. That way you maintain the feel the whole way through the loop. So now I'm going to demonstrate, and I'm actually going to lay down the first rhythm part along with a metronome using the busiest part first, and I'm going to start with the end and end with the beginning. So as I stop my metronome there, what you'll hear, this is much more consistent because I did it with a metronome, and as we get to the end, you're going to hear it perfectly loop. That perfect looping happens because I started with the end and I ended with the beginning. Tip number 6 is use different tones. So we're creating 3 separate layers. We got our main one. And for that, I had my pickup selector on position 2, which neck, bridge, middle. And so it had kind of a twangy tone. For the bass part, I'm going to roll it up to the neck pickup for a fatter sound, and I'm also going to roll the tone down. The reason is all these parts are going to be played together through the same amp, and one of the only ways to distinguish them is to use different tones as you record them. And then for the last one, I might also use, I'll flip it down to the bridge position and roll the treble back a little bit. So let me go through and add those layers now. Tip number 7, which we've kind of already covered, is avoid the high strings. When you solo, you're going to be using a lot of single note stuff on the higher strings. That's typically where we solo. So when you're playing your loop, when you're laying down your parts for your rhythm, you want to mostly avoid the high strings as a general guideline. But if you do want to use them, that takes you to tip number 8, which is to fill space. Like I said, soloing is full of transients and lots of single note, especially if you're doing Albert King style stuff. So as a contrast for the rhythm, that's why we turned our tone down and filling space means we're not putting a whole lot of transients in there. We're using things that kind of ring out and fill space. So those are 8 tips for using the Ditto, and the nice thing is once you get them, now you can have some fun and you can actually solo over it. So now I'm going to play over the loop that I created, and I hope this video is useful. Until next time, thanks for watching.